Containers of American poultry and pork are expected to dock at South African ports over the next few weeks. That's according to the Trade and Industry Minister Parks Tau, who announced during a joint briefing with Agriculture Minister John Steenhuisen.
Our leading story for this morning, Tiger Brands is feeling the backlash in the listeriosis outbreak beyond the South African borders. Several SADC countries have banned the import of its processed meat products.
It's getting more difficult for meat companies, apparently, to make higher profits from pork. So meat company Tyson reporting declining quarterly margins for their pork businesses in August, with a 2.4% decline in pork operating income. The USDA saying that pork exports saw a 68% decline in the U.S. during the first 6 months of the year compared to this same time.
The South African Post Office has suspended all outbound parcel services containing goods to the United States of America with immediate effect.
The Iowa State Fairgrounds are packed this week with people, pigs, and lots of pork. But this year's World Pork Expo comes with a side of concern.
The bottom line is we're in a very uncertain period, and uncertainty is not good for investment.
In retaliation to recent tariffs from the U.S., Mexico joined China this week, announcing its own set of tariffs.
This issue that Donald Trump fears so much, we offer this question of the land. I don't know what Donald Trump has to do with South African land, because he's never been here. And he must keep his America, we will keep our South Africa. That's what he must do. South Africa is our land. South Africa belongs to all the people who live here in South Africa. It does not belong to Donald Trump. He can keep his America. And Ene is even worse. He's even worse. When I meet him, I will tell him. I'll say, you, Donald Trump, you are even worse, because your forebears came to America. They found the indigenous Americans. They wiped them out. They killed nearly all of them. Rene, we are living as a nation, and black and white, we are going to find solutions for our land question. So Donald Trump must leave us alone. He must leave us alone, Gauri. When we were facing apartheid, when we were facing oppression, he was not here. He did not fight side by side with us. And we were able, on our own, yes, with support of progressive forces in the world, to resolve the apartheid question. As far as I recall, Donald Trump was not around the negotiating table when we negotiated the end of apartheid. So stick around there in the White House. We will do our business here, and we will find solutions for our problem. So stay out of our issues, and we will not get involved in your issues in America. You have your own problems. Leave us alone.
For generations, Miami has been a haven for those fleeing communist tyranny in South Africa. I mean, if you take a look at what's going on in parts of South Africa, look at South Africa, what's going on. Look at South America, what's going on. You know, I'm not going to, we have a G20 meeting in South Africa. South Africa shouldn't even be in the Gs anymore, because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told him I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
Shockwaves from Africa's pork import ban continued to move across the world like a slow, unstoppable tide. While American farms struggled to stay afloat, Africa entered a new phase of its strategy, one driven not by retaliation, but by ambition. The continent had realized that dependence on foreign agricultural imports was no longer sustainable. It had the land, the climate, and the emerging technology to feed itself and export. All it lacked was the political will that had at last arrived. Across the African continent, governments launched massive domestic production initiatives. Large tracts of underutilized farmland were revitalized, modern barns constructed, and new feed systems introduced. Universities partnered with agricultural research centers in Asia and South America, giving rise to homegrown solutions tailor-made for African ecosystems. The ban on foreign pork was no longer just a trade policy, it was fuel for a transformative agricultural renaissance. Meanwhile, in Washington, the pressure was unbearable. Farms in the Midwest were collapsing faster than government bailouts could rescue them. Entire counties that once relied solely on pork export revenues were forced to close long-running family businesses. Processing plants shut their doors. Cold storage facilities filled beyond capacity. The pork surplus became so massive that even domestic consumption couldn't absorb it. Yet, as disastrous as the situation was, the crisis had only begun. Africa's new agricultural strategy had included partnerships with tech companies from India and Brazil, enabling the continent to shift from import dependence to export readiness within a shockingly short period. Drone-assisted breeding programs, climate-adaptive feed processes, and disease-resistant livestock strains allowed African farms to advance in ways many outside observers never predicted. Suddenly, African nations were not only producing enough pork internally, they were on the verge of becoming exporters. This was the part that pushed American lawmakers into panic. It wasn't simply the loss of Africa as a buyer. It was the fear of Africa emerging as a competitor. As the United States debated emergency intervention, Africa unveiled its newest strategic initiative, a Continental Agricultural Stabilization Agreement. Under this pact, member nations would share technology, resources, and regional production zones. West Africa specialized in feed production. East Africa built major processing plants. Southern Africa expanded breeding and veterinary research. North Africa focused on logistics and port efficiency. The collective ambition was clear. Africa no longer wanted to be the bottom rung of the global food chain. It wanted to set the terms. But the consequences of such ambitions were not merely economic, they were political. In various African capitals, citizens celebrated the rising influence of their continent. Streets filled with banners praising local farmers. Radio stations broadcast updates on new processing plants opening in rural districts. Television networks ran documentaries about Africa's agricultural future. For the first time in generations, farmers, smallholders, and commercial producers alike felt recognized, empowered, and essential. American farmers saw a different story on their screens. They watched as their government scrambled to renegotiate trade deals that no longer mattered. They watched as foreign investors abandoned U.S. pork in favor of emerging markets. They watched as commodity prices fell to the lowest levels in decades. Many began to question whether the global dominance they once took for granted had been an illusion shattered the moment Africa decided to stand on its own. Yet the crisis soon expanded beyond pork. The U.S. agricultural system relied heavily on a predictable global market: soybeans to China, beef to the Middle East, pork to Africa, corn everywhere. When the pork market collapsed, dominoes followed. Feed prices plummeted, forcing grain producers into financial trouble. Equipment manufacturers reported dramatic declines in orders. Rural banks grew nervous as thousands of farmers defaulted on loans. Agriculture, once a symbol of American strength, now showed its fragility. Meanwhile, Africa's agricultural revolution grew even more coordinated. Several nations launched livestock insurance funds to stabilize domestic producers. Others invested in refrigerated transportation fleets, linking rural farms to major coastal ports. International investors, drawn by the continent's rapid growth, poured money into processing plants and research labs. Global agritech companies opened offices in Nairobi, Accra, Kigali, and Gaborone, cities increasingly seen as the future of food technology. This new reality forced the U.S. to confront the truth. It had underestimated Africa's potential, and now it was paying the price. Yet deeper changes were unfolding beneath the surface. In strategic discussions within Africa's continental institutions, leaders examined not only agriculture but broader global positioning. If Africa could disrupt the U.S. pork industry so easily, what could it do in other sectors? What could be achieved with coffee, cocoa, lithium, gold, natural gas, or manganese? What about technology markets? Textiles? Pharmaceuticals? The pork ban became symbolic, a moment representing the dawn of a new economic assertiveness. For decades, Africa had been treated as a supplier of raw goods and a buyer of finished products. But now the world saw a continent that could act collectively, strategically, and unapologetically. The pork ban did not weaken Africa, it strengthened it. It unified it. It gave it leverage, and the world could no longer ignore that leverage. In Europe, governments watched warily as African nations developed new trade relationships with Asia and South America. European farmers, already under strain, feared that Africa's rise would further reduce their export markets. In Asia, policymakers welcomed Africa's shift, seeing opportunity for deeper cooperation without the historical baggage associated with Western relations. In Latin America, agricultural blocs exchanged data with African researchers, forming partnerships that bypassed traditional global power centers. Every region saw Africa differently, but all recognized that it was no longer a passive actor. Back in the United States, the political climate grew increasingly tense. News networks hosted debates about how Africa's decision had triggered the worst agricultural crisis in recent memory. Lawmakers blamed each other. Lobbyists demanded relief packages. Economists warned that rural instability could trigger wider social unrest. Yet ironically, the crisis forced many ordinary Americans to notice something they had long overlooked. Africa was rising, and fast. But in Africa itself, the mood was not celebratory. It was determined. Farmers, researchers, students, and policymakers understood that the ban on foreign pork was not about retaliation, it was about survival. It was about building a food-secure future. It was about proving that the continent could rely on its own capabilities. And as they watched American markets collapse under pressure, they saw the importance of controlling the terms of engagement. Still, global markets are never still for long. As Africa became more confident, new challenges emerged. Climate fluctuations tested the resilience of newly built farms. Sudden increases in domestic production led to surpluses in some regions. Infrastructure shortages created bottlenecks at ports. Yet every challenge offered a chance for innovation. African engineers designed new cold storage facilities powered by solar energy. Local startups built livestock tracking systems to monitor health and productivity. Regional banks created financial tools tailored to rural communities. Each solution pushed Africa further ahead. Meanwhile, American farmers, desperate to adapt, attempted to reorient toward domestic markets. Some shifted to plant-based food partnerships. Others diversified into crops that still had international demand. But such transitions required time they didn't have. Many farms, especially small family-owned ones, were forced to close permanently. In Washington, a new strategy began to form. If Africa no longer needed U.S. pork, perhaps the United States could benefit from Africa's rising prosperity. Trade specialists proposed new agreements focused on technology, machinery, and renewable energy cooperation. Analysts urged the government not to see Africa as a lost market, but as a potential partner in future industries. Whether Africa would accept such partnerships was another question. Diplomatic delegations traveled to African capitals, but the tone of negotiations had changed. The United States no longer approached Africa with the confidence of a supplier speaking to a buyer. Instead, it came as a nation seeking entry into the world's fastest-growing agricultural frontier. African leaders made it clear. Any partnership going forward would be on equal terms. Years before, such terms would have been unimaginable. Now they were the baseline. The shift marked a new chapter in global economics not defined by dominance but by interdependence. Africa's pork ban had exposed vulnerabilities in traditional powers while proving the potential of coordinated African policy. It demonstrated that the continent's decisions could move markets, reshape industries, and influence global strategies. As the dust settled, one truth became clear. Africa had rewritten the rules of global trade. The United States had learned a painful lesson about over-reliance on export markets. Europe recognized the urgency of competing. In a new global landscape, Asia deepened its partnerships with Africa, and Africa, once sidelined in international negotiations, now shaped conversations about food security, market access, and global supply chains. The pork ban was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new kind of world. A world where Africa's choices carried weight. A world where global powers adapted or faced collapse. A world where no continent could be ignored. And as U.S. farmers continued to search for new directions, Africa marched confidently toward its agricultural future, determined never again to let external markets dictate its destiny. The U.S. attempted to challenge the ban in international trade courts, accusing African governments of discriminating against foreign products. But Africa defended its decision by pointing to global precedents, environmental concerns, food safety standards, and the right of nations to protect domestic industries. Surprisingly, several Asian and Latin American nations sided with Africa, arguing that the continent had long suffered from agricultural dependency imposed by wealthier nations. The U.S. lost the case. The situation worsened as African nations forged new regional partnerships. The African Continental Free Trade Area used the pork ban as its first major economic coordination effort, strengthening trade among member states and setting a precedent for future agricultural independence movements. American pork companies responded with desperation. They slashed prices globally, attempting to flood markets in Southeast Asia, South America, and Eastern Europe. But this strategy triggered backlash. Competing producers accused the U.S. of dumping selling below cost to dominate markets. Several nations imposed tariffs. Brazil, in particular, fiercely resisted, defending its own pork industry. By the 6th month, the U.S. pork industry had collapsed by 60%. The Midwest saw widespread foreclosures. Auction houses were flooded with cheap farm equipment. Banks tightened lending. Rural America felt the crisis more than any urban region ever could. U.S. grocery prices dropped at first, but that brief relief evaporated as smaller farms went bankrupt, with fewer producers left standing. Long-term supply instability led to price spikes. Domestic consumers faced shortages in some regions, and price surges in others. The industry had been so dependent on exports that losing Africa destabilized the entire system. Meanwhile, African markets flourished. Local farmers gained unprecedented support. Governments offered subsidies, loans, training programs, and land grants. Agricultural universities expanded research. High-quality African pork began appearing in supermarkets that had once been filled with imported products. Restaurants proudly advertised local ingredients. The movement wasn't just economic, it became cultural. Across Africa, consumers celebrated the shift as a victory for economic independence. International investors took notice. Middle Eastern companies funded massive slaughterhouses in East Africa. Asian firms partnered with West African feed producers. European cooperatives offered technical expertise to align African production with global standards. Africa had created a new industry, and it was thriving. The rest of the world watched with a mix of confusion, admiration, and concern. For years, African nations had been portrayed as dependent, underdeveloped, or unstable. But now the continent was demonstrating an unprecedented level of unity and strategic capability. Economists wrote detailed reports on how Africa's decision reshaped global trade. They concluded that the ban exposed vulnerabilities in major Western agricultural systems and highlighted Africa's potential as a global economic force, one capable of setting the terms, not merely accepting them. The U.S., still reeling, tried to rebuild. It launched programs encouraging pork diversification, alternative exports, and new domestic consumption campaigns. But the damage was deep. Tens of thousands of farms never recovered. The pork industry consolidated into a handful of corporate giants. Rural towns shrank as young workers moved to cities in search of stable employment. Across Africa, however, the story was very different. Livestock production surged. Rural prosperity blossomed. Nations that had spent decades importing food now exported value-added products to neighboring states. The ban became a case study in agricultural sovereignty, inspiring movements in grain production, dairy, and poultry. What the world learned was simple. Africa had the power to shift global markets, and it had chosen to use that power. The crash of the U.S. pork market became a turning point in global agricultural history. It revealed that economic dominance could no longer rest on assumptions, and that nations once ignored in international negotiations were now capable of rewriting the rules. Africa's pork import ban was never just about meat. It was about dignity, independence, economic justice, and a future reclaimed. And in that new future, Africa no longer stood as a passive participant in global trade. It stood as a force that could change the world with a single decision.